Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me in the back? No? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me in the back? Okay.
She'll get you dialed in.
Okay. I know we are all good Lutherans here, but I would encourage the good Lutherans in the back to move a little farther forward so that you can read the Chinese a little better on the screen as we go along.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'll get started with introduction of our new speaker here. He'll be here for 3 weeks. His name is Glenn Thompson. He's a professor. He's a 1977 graduate of Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. He earned a PhD in ancient history from Columbia University and served 43 years in Wells positions as a missionary in places such as Zambia, New York City, Hong Kong. He was also a professor at Michigan Lutheran Seminary and Wisconsin Lutheran College. He's published nearly a dozen books and several dozen articles and is an internationally recognized expert on St. Paul's missionary journeys and various aspects of early church history. Retired since 2020, he lives in Milwaukee with his wife Beth while continuing his research and writing. His latest book, Jingzhou, the Earliest Christian Church in China, is the subject for this 3-part study series. The study series, The Challenges of Bringing Christianity to Medieval China. A Christian general honored by the Tang Dynasty emperors, 2 Chinese Christian monks walking thousands of miles to the Middle East. These are just 2 intriguing stories of the early Christian presence in China. This 3-part series will tell the amazing story of how Christians from the Middle East brought the gospel to China from 1635 to 1375. Besides introducing the missionaries, the texts, and the archaeological artifacts of early Christian China, we'll examine the challenges encountered in putting the good news into forms understandable to the Chinese populace. Professor, pastor, and missionary Dr. Glenn Thompson, serving in Hong Kong until his retirement in 2020, will guide us through this study. He also has books up there for purchase if you'd like to get one.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, the book that is the basis for these lectures just came out from Erdman's Publishing Company this February, and you can get it for the discount price of $25 over here, together with a signature by the author. And a few of my other books are available there too. You can find them all on Amazon. If you look up Glenn L. Thompson, make sure you put the L in the middle to get the right Glenn Thompson. All my books are available up there. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I actually am a former member of St. John's, though virtually nobody knows that. It was only for 2 years, from 1968 to 1970, when my father took a call to be the coach of the old Wisconsin Lutheran College, Wisconsin Lutheran Teachers College, that preceded the current college, for the last 2 years of its existence, from 1968 to 1970. And then he moved out to Watertown to become the coach at Northwestern College, and so we moved membership. Those were my first 2 years of study at the college in Watertown, but I came in here and knew Pastor Otto and the pastors and was a member here formally for 2 years. But I have been back many times. We lived down on 85th and Burleigh, members at St. Philip's for the last 20 years. So we come here occasionally for worship, and many of you are familiar with that. And I have been a longtime friend of Pastor Yu, and have attended the Chinese services on and off over the years as well. So it's a great time to be here. Yeah, and my wife will be over here, the beautiful lady behind the desk, willing to sell you books afterwards. And we also have another special guest. When I retired in 2020 and moved back from Hong Kong, I was replaced by one of my former students, Professor Chung Guok Phai, who happens to be with us. He just arrived in the U.S. a couple days ago, and he will be attending summer school up in Mequon. So he will be here to correct anything I missay this morning during my lecture. That's his job.
By the way, I want to say, Dr. Thomason invited me to Milwaukee.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, he came for an interview way back when, and so yes, our relationship goes far back. And actually, I was present in Hangzhou for the baptism of Joshua's wife's parents many years ago in China. So I knew her and Yue even before they came to the United States as well, when Joshua was the only one here. So our subject is going to be divided into these 3 Sundays, and we're going to start by talking about the beginning of mission work in China this morning. Next week we're going to talk a little bit more about the theology, what it was like to be a missionary in China and to try to describe Chinese Christianity to Chinese people long ago. And then the third week we're going to kind of take through the story to the end to the second wave of Christianity in China, and even more fascinating stories, the ones about the monks I mentioned there. But would like you to think a little bit, just by accident, I had this slide, which happens to also be the sermon text, the first thing for this morning. Pastor Schrader didn't tip me off about that. But it almost sounds like when Paul is talking to the Colossians and says the gospel is bearing fruit and growing in the entire world, that the gospel had spread everywhere already in the first decades. A little later, he says in verse 23, "This is the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven." How widely did the gospel spread? And you have this little sheet you can take some notes on this morning, or just to guide you or be a memento of this morning. But we can ask ourselves, 2,000 years later, we can say pretty much the same things that Paul was saying here. Paul was already seeing the gospel spread very widely, and we still see this gospel spreading very widely yet today, and yet the Great Commission hasn't quite been totally fulfilled yet, has it? The gospel has not reached everywhere. St. Paul didn't really say that. If you took these verses out of context, you might take that as your conclusion, that the apostle said, yeah, the gospel's already spreading everywhere. But remember, Paul's world was the Mediterranean, the Roman Empire, and it didn't quite go farther to the east or west. The New Worlds hadn't been discovered yet by our Western civilization. And so when Paul talks in these terms, he's talking about the world that he knew where the gospel was spreading. Many people think, however, have said over the years, even Bible scholars, that the apostles must have evangelized everywhere. And we know that they did evangelize quite widely. But we only really have a few stories. Remember, if you were in this early service and heard the sermon, Pastor Schrader talked about the Apostle Paul being the great missionary. But that great missionary only kind of went west through the Mediterranean world. We know stories of the other apostles going east, but they're not in the Bible, and we can't verify them, so we really don't know exactly how far it spread. But we, as a church historian, and that's what I'm trained at, I try to warn people that we have to be a little careful not to think of the early apostles as superheroes, that they were able to do everything and get the whole job done. And when we hear stories of what they do, we have to take them a little bit, if they're not in Scripture, that means that we can't take them at face value as always totally honest, totally accurate. So the story of the early church is an exciting story and a story of great spreading, but we also have to keep it in focus. And some people have claimed that the Apostle Thomas made it all the way to China in the 1st century, and I've written some articles trying to show that we have no evidence for that whatsoever, and that we have to be careful about making those kind of claims. But by the year 200, we had a church father living in Carthage in North Africa, Northwest Africa, who said, look, the nations are there now where we find Christian believers among the Parthians, the Medes, the Elamites, in fact, all of Mesopotamia, Armenia, Phrygia, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Pamphylia, all the areas of modern Turkey and southern Asia, below Russia, among the Romans and others, and the inhabitants of Africa and Egypt, Jerusalem, various tribes of the Berbers, which is northwest Africa, Spain and the Gauls, and even the places of the Britons. By 200, there were even Christians in Britain already, all the way from Palestine. And even more amazing, even those Germans somehow got the gospel, he said, by 200, those barbarians up there in the forests of Central Europe. So in all these places, the name of Christ, who has already come, now reigns. Now, Tertullian was probably overstating the case because the Christians were not in a majority in any of these places. They were still a minority. But his point is that already within 150 years, the gospel had already spread very widely. When we talk about Chinese Christianity, people, maybe you've heard that right now Chinese Christianity is huge. There might be as many as 100 million Christians in China right now. And it's totally indigenous because missionaries haven't been allowed in there since 1950 when the communists took over. But we had Protestant and Catholic missionaries in there starting in the 1800s. And before that, the Jesuit missionaries came in the 1600s. And then the story that I'm going to tell you goes even further back. 2 weeks from now, we're going to talk about the Church of the East under the Yuan dynasty, starting about the year 1000 to 1400. And today and next week, we're going to talk specifically about the Church of the East under the Tang dynasty. How already by the middle of the 7th century, Christianity had spread into China. And under the name Jingzhao, that is the Chinese name for what we're going to be talking about this morning. So this is the subject of my book and the subject of our two things. And this is the guy who made me do all of this work. Indiana Jones here, his other name is Martin Palmer. I made my first trip to be a guest speaker in Hong Kong at our seminary there in 1999. And then I was invited back for a whole semester in 2001. And during that time, this book had just come out, and somebody told me about it, and I started reading it. And he had made all sorts of claims about early Christianity in China, and a very fascinating book. But if you look at his subtitle, Rediscovering the Lost Scrolls of Taoist Christianity, his argument was that Christian missionaries had come into China and had become half Taoist, half Buddhist, and had mixed all these religions into a beautiful religion in the Tang dynasty. I looked at his evidence and I said, this guy I don't think is reading these texts properly. His arguments did not make any sense to me at all. Why would Christian missionaries travel 2,000 to 3,000 miles into China just to sell out their faith and become Buddhist or Taoist? That made no sense to me. So I started looking around for something better that I could read about it and something my students could read, and guess what? I didn't find anything. So I started researching it myself, found a couple good books from 100 years ago that were now outdated and everything. But the long and the short of it was I ended up having to write something for my students, and that's why I have written this book. And it is the first book in 100 years that has been written in English that tells this story in what I would call an objective way, written by an objective, semi-objective historian. That's supposed to be me. So this guy I thank for his bad book and for getting me interested in this early subject, because I had already been teaching church history in Zambia when I was there and other places. I was supposed to be kind of a historical expert on the early church, and I had never heard this story. It was a brand new story to me, and it's still an exciting one. Now, how come I had not heard this story, and how come you had not heard that story? And if you had gone to our seminary and taken church history classes, you would not have heard this story. It's because when we study the early church, we're basically studying the Roman Empire and what happened in the Roman Empire. And usually when we talk about the early church, we talk about two parts of it, the Latin church and the Greek church. So we know how the gospel started in Palestine, and the book of Acts tells us how Paul spread the gospel, and all of those places that Paul talks about are either in Turkey or Greece or Rome or in Italy today. Those three areas. And we know the gospel also spread across North Africa. So that within 100 years we had Christian congregations all over the Mediterranean world. And we know about this, and quite a bit about this, because a guy named Eusebius, in the year 310 about, wrote a nice history book. He was a Christian bishop who said, we got to tell the story about what happens after the book of Acts. And he writes the first Christian history book. And it's one you can still read today. It's still the one that we read when we were doing church history, and it's a marvelous book. But he was the bishop right here in Caesarea in northern Palestine, and almost everything he talks about took place in the Greek half of the Roman Empire. You remember how Alexander the Great had come through and conquered everything 300 years before Christ. After him, this half, everything basically right on this side of that line, Greek was kind of the common language, the lingua franca, the English of that day. Everything on that side, Latin, became the common language. And so as the early church grew, the New Testament is written in Greek, and it was the Old Testament in Hebrew, but those Hebrew apostles wrote the New Testament mostly in Greek. Even their original things, as far as we know, were all in Greek. But they soon got translated into Latin because that's what needed to be done to get the other part of the Roman Empire. But these two languages were all you needed. You didn't have to put the Bible into a lot of other languages to basically evangelize the whole Roman world. And Eusebius tells us that story, and this is what we all learn about. If you go and pick up a book on church history, that's what you're going to hear about. But we don't hear that there was actually a third place and a third language, Syriac. Syriac is a dialect of Hebrew, very close to exactly the language that the early apostles probably spoke and that Jesus spoke, and that the gospel spread eastwards from Palestine just as much as it spread to the west. But we never hear that part of the story. During this period, we had several big empires. Besides the Roman Empire, we have the Parthian Empire in Persia, the Persian Empire, but it's in this period called the Parthians. In India, we had the Gupta Empire, the Mauryan Gupta Empire, and in China, we have the Han Dynasty, the first big empire in China at the same time. So the gospel spread in this direction also, but we just don't hear about it very much. From Antioch, the same place that sent Paul and Barnabas out, missionaries went the other direction as well, up to Edessa in modern-day Syria, and this became a center for Christianity, and it continued to spread further east. In fact, the king of one of the nearby areas, Abgar, has supposedly been converted to Christianity already about the year 200. So we have rulers as well coming to Christianity. And it spread all the way through the areas where Islam is now so dominant, all the way down into Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Iran, Iraq, all of this area, Christianity was spreading, and it was perhaps the biggest minority religion. There was no majority religion, a bunch of different religions, but perhaps the largest religion with 20-25% of the people was Christianity in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. And it continued to go. And one of the reasons it continued to go farther east was something called the Silk Road. Before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the language that was used. Syriac. It looks very strange, huh? A little bit like Hebrew, a little bit like Arabic. And it's kind of an intermediate language between those two. And this is the dominant language that was used like English across much of the Middle East at this period, and it became the liturgical language in which the Christians worshiped. So besides the Western Church worshiping in Latin and the Eastern Roman Church worshiping in Greek, you also had this language, Syriac, with probably an equal number of people worshiping in this language throughout the Middle East. And by the 2nd century, we already start getting Bible translations. Those of us who study old Bible texts and manuscripts, we've studied many of these, and you can go to the British Museum or the Vatican Library, and some dating back to the 2nd and 3rd century, we have examples of these kind of Bibles that are there. So they had the Bible, they had missionaries, they had a language, they had lots of writings, Christian writings in this language, and it started spreading more and more to the east. But we had a little bit of a political problem because the Parthians of Persia and the Romans were fighting each other. Everybody was trying to control the Middle East. And so you had this battle going on between, almost constant fighting. Every few years, the Roman generals would come into Persia and get some territory, and 10 years later the Persians would counterattack, take it back, and go and take a little bit of Roman territory. This border war kept going back and forth for 100, 200 years. And what happens? The Christians, as so often, get caught in the middle. If you're a Christian, what happened in the Roman Empire around the year 300? An emperor named Constantine became a Christian. And very soon the Roman Empire was all Christian, at least in name. And the Parthians knew that. So if they had Christians in their territory, they looked at those Christians with a bit of suspicion and wondered, I wonder if they're going to be loyal to our people or if they will be traitors and help the Romans. So this led to persecution of Christians in the Parthian Empire. And this becomes a problem and it really hasn't changed. Right up until today, we have Christians in today's modern Syria, Iran, Iraq, and they have gotten caught right in the middle of all the fighting between Sunnis and Shiites for the last 100 years, and thousands have died, and tens of thousands have had to emigrate. And so here in Milwaukee, we have a Syrian-speaking church where you can go and hear this Syriac liturgy, by the way. Here in Milwaukee, huge populations in Detroit, in Australia, UK, Canada, various places, because about 75%, I think, of all the Christians from the Middle East now are living here in the West someplace because of the persecution and the instability that's happened over there. So this church we're going to talk about is going to continue for 2,000 years, right up to the present. Now, the other problem that came in was a problem of names. So most of you have not heard the name Nestorius before, but this is a bad name. Nestorius was actually a Christian bishop in the capital city of Constantinople, modern Istanbul. But he had some false teachings, ideas about Jesus. During this time, when he was bishop, they had just kind of figured out how to talk about Jesus' two natures as being human and divine and so forth, but he didn't agree with exactly how they did it. And so he said, when we're talking about Mary, for instance, the Virgin Mary, we should not call her the Mother of God. How can you be the Mother of God? We should call her the Mother of Christ, because yes, Jesus Christ, she was his mother, but can you really be the Mother of God? She didn't really understand our conception of Jesus being fully God and fully human. And as a result of this, he gets his teachings on that Christ had two separate natures, he gets excommunicated at a big church council. And after he's excommunicated, he's sent into exile. And his supporters, because the government is controlled by the church, his supporters feel they have to leave the Roman Empire so that they can worship freely, a bit like the Puritans at the beginning of America. And so where do they move? They move eastward across the border into Parthia. And they become members of the church in the east. But the Western Christians kept calling them Nestorians after the name of this guy. Now, what happens anytime you start giving a derogatory name to people that isn't, it's meant to be a bad name, right? He's a heretic, Nestorius is a heretic, so if you call him this group Nestorians, you're immediately saying, there's something wrong with these people, they're not right. And this is going to become a problem. Interestingly, as much as we know, the church in this part did not teach any of the ideas of Nestorius at all. They kind of respected Nestorius because he stood up for his faith, but they didn't take his teachings into their church. But we're going to find out what happened. The bad news is this name can't get rid of it. In fact, if you go into the museum in Hong Kong today and look at the little crosses that have come from central China that we're going to talk about in a couple weeks, what's the sign going to say? Nestorian crosses. Those of us who are scholars of this period are trying to get rid of that name and say, don't call it Nestorius anymore, because as far as we know, they were not teaching the heresy of Nestorius. So let's not use that derogatory name. But this is one of the reasons that this story I'm going to tell you has not been told, and it was not even of very much interest to Chinese Christians for a long time. Because the early missionaries and others called this church Nestorian, and so everybody said, oh, they're just a bunch of heretics, we don't need to talk about them anymore. And so this whole story was dismissed just because of this name that was given them, a derogatory name early on. So this idea that they were called Nestorians, it was kind of a short name that was used at the beginning, not maybe in a derogatory sense, but it became derogatory over the years, and it has affected how people went. So at the same time as this was happening, the Eastern Church, the Greek-speaking church, started splitting up because of other heresies as well. So this area in the green is today, became the Greek-speaking church for a long time. And today we, just down the road, have a Greek Orthodox church, right? They trace their heritage to this, and Greek remained the language of this area, and they kept the name Orthodox, meaning that this was the group that was following the early teachings of the church. Down in Egypt, we had another group that split off, though. They became known as the Coptic Church. By the way, we have a Coptic church down south of town, too, down by the IKEA on the south side. Egyptian Christians, and that church continues till today as well, often persecuted. We have some other people with some false ideas about Jesus' two natures called the Monophysites, who were Syriac speaking in the area around Syria, But the group we're going to talk about is the one in the red that covered most of the Middle East, and we're just going to call them the Church of the East. And that's the name they gave themselves because they were the easternmost of all of these churches. So this Church of the East is the one that also spoke Syriac and who continued to do mission work throughout the Middle East, and they were wonderfully mission-minded. Some experts think that there were times in the 4th, 5th century when there were more Christians speaking Syriac than there were Latin-speaking Christians or Greek-speaking Christians in the West. And we know, for instance, that early on they got as far as India, and that there was a church in India by the 2nd or 3rd century that was Syriac-speaking, called the Church of St. Thomas. And there are Thomas Christians yet today who trace their roots in India back to this early Christianity. Sometimes some Christians in the West, when these fightings were going on, they got captured soldiers and they got resettled in the East. So it was a bit of a mix. But more and more, they became known as for their mission work because they just kept spreading farther and farther to the east. Now, this is a series of roads that connected the Middle East and Europe with China. And it goes back to about the time of Christ or a little before. And it ends up becoming known as the Silk Road. Some of you have heard of that before. Usually in the West, when we hear of the Silk Road, we think of a famous Italian traveler in the Middle Ages named Marco Polo, yes. And this was the same route that Marco Polo used, but it was in use already for 2,000 years by the time he got on the road and used it. And we can trace the spread of Christianity in Syriac in the 5th century as it goes further and further down the Silk Road. And we're going to talk about how it ends up getting to the capital of China, modern Xi'an, ancient Chang'an, in the year 635. Depending on wars, when wars were going on, it was pretty hard to travel 2,000 miles with that kind of instability. But whenever we had peace from one area to the other, this became a very important road. And we know more and more, as a Roman historian, I was just reading recently about how even steel was being taken. We often think of silk coming from China, but steel was taken from China over to the West because they made much better steel in the Han Dynasty and the dynasties afterwards in China, and the Roman soldiers wanted that high quality steel. So a lot of trade going on back and forth, and wherever trade goes on, Christianity can follow along as well. And that's exactly what happened in these early years. But we shouldn't get the idea that these early missionaries were Marco Polos, okay? Marco Polo got on his camel back in Eastern Europe and got off it when he got into China, right? That's not how trade usually worked. Normally, you had a group of people. So the Romans, traders, would take their goods and they would sell them to the Parthians. The Parthians would take it across their land and sell it to the Kushans or Sogdians, who would then sell it to the Chinese. So you had a series of middlemen. And because of the language differences and all the travel problems, this is the way trade usually went. You would pass it on to the next person and they would pass it on. And the interesting people are these Sogdians. The Sogdians sometimes went all the way over and got it from the Romans and took it to the Chinese. And Sogdia, which I'm sure, anybody ever hear of Sogdia before coming here? Okay, make sure you write it down and so you learned one thing this morning. And we actually have a picture of a Sogdian here, riding his camel along the Silk Road. And if you look up close, this guy doesn't look very Chinese, does he? But this is a Chinese statue about this big from the Tang Dynasty of one of these Sogdian traders. And they have the big beard And that kind of floppy hat looks a little bit like a elf hat. And that's typical of the Sogdians at this point. And it's very likely that some of the missionaries we talk about this morning are Sogdian missionaries. And the other last thing we need to do is, for background, is talk about the spread of Islam. That arose in the 7th century. Already Christians were throughout this area, but as Islam spread, it also increased the mission work. Many Christians no longer felt at home in their home area after it was taken over by Muslims, so they would move and find new areas, and that would help the spread of Christianity as well. So by the time we get to the 7th century, we have perhaps the greatest of all the golden ages of Chinese history, the Tang Dynasty. And today yet, the Tang Dynasty, if you go to visit China, you can go to the Tang Dynasty show in the evening where they'll have all the dancers and the musicians and the poets telling you all of the great things that happened during the Tang Dynasty. This was a great high point of culture, much like the Renaissance in Europe. And it was a great period of stability, but also one of the few periods when the Chinese rulers were not keeping the borders sealed and keeping all Westerners out. China is so big and it has such a good, stable, old culture that most of the time the rulers say, we don't need the rest of the world. And they just kind of close the borders and keep everybody in. And of course that keeps them in power better as well. And that happened through most of Chinese history, but during the Tang Dynasty, the borders opened and they were welcoming the foreigners in, and that also gave us an opportunity for Christianity to come. Now you see an ink rubbing over here. This is a life-size, supposed to be an original ink rubbing of this big stone. And this is what was inscribed on one of the sides of the stone. There are two sides that have inscriptions on as well. And we know that this stone was erected in 781. It was discovered in the 1600s, and it talks, and notice what it's often called, the Nestorian stele. I should really take that off my slide too. But it talks about the luminous religion. We have a couple Chinese people here this morning. So Jing Zhao is the pronunciation in Chinese, and this was the name that they gave their own church in China, the first Christian church. And you see the two characters, Jing meaning luminous, and Zhao means a teaching or a religion. So the luminous teaching, the religion of light, the religion that brings light, a great name to give the Christian religion, right? Can you see the difference, however, when I use the modern font on my computer, Chinese font, to print out these, they look this way. Can you see the difference in the first character? How characters are made up of different subsections, and the two top ones, you notice here we have a box, and here we have a box with a line through the middle, and the two of them are reversed on this side. This is never found anywhere in Chinese literature, anywhere except when we're talking about this Christian religion. And the Chinese scholars who've worked on this have tried to explain, is this just a variation or whatever? But Samuel Liu, one of my friends and one of the great scholars in this area, he thinks that this is the Chinese version of Toys R Us. Remember Toys R Us? How they put the R backwards to make their logo distinctive? He thinks that that's what they did here to make their name distinctive. So think Toys R Us when you think of the earliest Christianity in China. They wanted to kind of brand themselves to make themselves a little more distinct from the people around them. Now these are the characters that come from the very top of the stone, and it starts with the word Da Qin, which means big Qin, and Qin was the name of the earliest dynasty, great dynasty uniting China a couple centuries before Christ. But big Qin becomes used in medieval Chinese to mean that big empire somewhere far to the west. Sometimes it's used of Persia, but most of the time it's used of places beyond Persia. The Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, those places we've heard about far out there in Never Never Land, those great places. So this talks about the Da Qin luminous religion. So we know that that religion came from those people way out there in the west, spreading, Liu Xing, in China, Zhongguo, the still a name used for China today. And then monument, the last character here means the big stone. So this is the monument that is talking about the spread of Christianity, of the luminous religion in China. And you see that at the top, and then if you will come up later, you can see this is also written down the side as the introduction here. So when this was discovered by people, they immediately said, wow, this is a beautiful piece of Chinese inscription, wonderful thing. It had been buried, and they dug it up. But the other thing they noticed, that what do you have at the very top is a cross. Now the cross is not a symbol that is well known in China. It had no meaning as a religious symbol at all. It's the number 10. It can also have a few other meanings, but it's just the normal way to write the number 10. So the workmen who dug this up were scratching their heads and saying, what kind of monument this is? A beautiful Chinese thing. It's very old. It's got this strange symbol on top. And then the other thing that it had was other strange writing. And if you get a chance afterwards, come up and take a look. The very bottom here, along the side, a little bit here and a little bit here. And on the side pieces, underneath this modern graffiti that somebody put on top, you can see the same Syriac writing. But of course, these Chinese workmen had never seen Syriac writing before. This is just some strange writing. And they said, this is really an odd piece that we have here. But it is Syriac. Some people thought that this was a forgery, by the way, when it was discovered by Jesuit missionaries, got a hold of this, and they thought that this was some sort of, somebody had concocted this. But there's no way you can do this. So here's an example of some of the writing on the side, and it's a list of priests in Syriac. Yaakov Kashisha, Jacob the priest. Mar Sargis, the priest and the rural bishop. Paul the priest, Samson the priest, etc. So it talked about who the clergymen, the pastoral role, if you will, of this early church in China. Now, for a long time, after 1600 this was discovered, we knew nothing much else about this church. But in the city of Dunhuang, a desert oasis, around the beginning of the 20th century, a few more manuscripts were discovered, like this one, that 4 of them that talk about the teaching of the Messiah. One is talked about the one heaven. One is a retelling of the Sermon on the Mount in Chinese language, in Chinese culture. And then a few from the 8th century were also discovered, including a hymn and part of the liturgy, the Glory to God in the Highest that we sing in church on Sunday morning in some of our liturgies. We found a Chinese version of that from the 8th century in these things. So we have a few other things that have been discovered. This pillar was discovered just 10 years ago in Luoyang, which was the eastern capital at that time. Here's Pastor Adam Gowell, who went with me to see it. And this kind of pillar is traditionally a Buddhist pillar, a kind of a gravestone for Buddhists. But as you see, the new one that was discovered has a cross on the top and angels and a Christian text. In fact, one of the same Christian texts that were found in Dun Huang in the caves. And here we have an ink rubbing of those kind of things, of that text. And you can see again the cross with some angels flying on the sides, but looking a lot more like Chinese angels than our Western style angels. And we have a few other manuscripts in other languages about Christianity in this period as well. But it's mostly this one that is really useful for us. And as I said, it was erected in 781 and discovered in 1623. When it was discovered, a local Christian, the Jesuits, Catholic Jesuit missionaries had just gotten into China 20 or 30 years before this. And they had just started converting a few people. It was very difficult work. But one of them was this guy named Zhang Gengyu, who finds out about this new discovery, and he passes it on to Li Jizao, who was a very high-ranking Mandarin scholar in the government who had become a Christian. And they got really excited when they read this and said, "Isn't this the heavenly teaching preached by Li Jitai?" That's Matteo Ricci, the name for this Jesuit missionary. So they were really excited, and Chinese Christians still today are very excited when they hear about this, because it shows that Christianity really had existed in their country long before they had ever thought. And as you know, one of the things that always bothers us, well, what about my great-grandparents who didn't know the gospel, etc.? Well, there's a chance your great-grandparents did know the gospel, because Christianity was in China way back 1,000 years ago already. At the beginning of the inscription, it talks about the inscription and says that it was composed by a priest named Jingjing of the Daqin Temple. But then in Syriac, it calls him Adam, priest and chorepiscopus and metropolitan of China. So it's interesting that they keep this going. If you remember, Indiana Jones, Mr. Palmer, said that he thought that this religion, Christianity, had melded together with Taoism and Buddhism. But we know right from the stone itself that they kept not only their original language, but connection with the rest of the church back in the Middle East. These weren't just some people who went off on their own and did their own thing. And at the end of the inscription, it says this is when it was erected in 781, in the year of the chicken. You know how Chinese have the different years, etc. And it mentions Patriarch Ningxu, who was head of the Church of the East. And this is given both in Chinese and in Syriac, the father and father Mar Hananishu. This was the synod president way back in Persia at the time, President Schrader. Mar Hananishu was the president of the whole church body, and his name appears on here. So they kept connections back with the main mother church very closely back in Syria, even though it was 2,000, 3,000 miles away. So what's actually on the big inscription? It starts with a theological section, then it has a history of the Tang Dynasty and what happened to the church for the 150 years between the arrival of Christianity and the time the stele was put up. And then it ends with a poem that, among other things, praises God and the emperors. The beginning title on the first line calls this a poem with commentary. That is my translation of Song Bin Shu here. So I think the poem was written first, a beautiful poem about Christianity in China and how it had progressed between the emperors. And then they wrote the commentary. You know how poetry is. Remember, English class where they gave you a poem and then it took you a week to figure out what the poem was really saying, because it's so short and it's so expressive that it doesn't give all the details. It's exactly what we have here. So they wrote a very short and concise poem, and then they give the commentary to fill in all the details of what really happened at the time. So the poetry in Chinese is very beautiful. 4 characters each line. For each of the emperors that they talk about, they usually have 8 or 10 lines of 4 characters. So only 32 characters, which is 32 words or less that they have to say and talk about these different emperors and how Christianity came among them. And it starts with this part about the true faith. The true Lord is without origin, serene and unchangeable, with power and capacity to perfect and create. He raised up the earth, established the heavens, the divided being entered the world to save everyone. The rising sun dispels darkness and bears witness to his divine principle. Very beautiful. We who know the Christian message can read this and we can see the Christian message behind it, right? If you were not a Christian and you read those words, what would you think? It's talking about something beautiful, but maybe Martin Palmer was right. Maybe this is it sounds like it could apply to Buddhism or Taoism or some religion just as well. But when it's explained in the commentary, it talks about the eternal God, his creative work, etc. So next week we're going to talk about the theology, and we're going to talk about exactly how it describes Jesus and how it describes the rest of our Christian faith. Today we want to just finish by giving a little more of the background of the thing. So it says right on the stele that in the 9th year of this reign, in 635, the emperor sent his minister of state, Fang Xuanling, to receive Alopen. Alopen was the name of the missionary, the head of the missionary group, to receive him in the western suburbs and bring him in with a warm welcome. And one of the questions on your sheet is, why would a Chinese emperor send his prime minister out to welcome a new missionary that's just arrived in town?
Maybe he was Christian.
Christianity hadn't come yet to China, as far as we know.
If you view a new wisdom teaching comparable to Taoism or Confucianism.
Okay, but they hadn't had any Christian writings in China yet either, as far as we know. So nobody knew anything, and here's this dusty guy who's just traveled 3,000 miles, all sweaty and whatnot, and you send out your prime minister to visit, to welcome him in. Well, you're getting the point that something isn't right here, right? This guy could not have been just shown up unexpectedly. They were expecting him. And why would they be expecting him if there were no Christians in China? Well, there were Christians in China, but they were almost all foreigners. Remember those people from the Middle East who had been fleeing Islam and so forth? Traders, Christian traders moving in. So there was probably a Christian community of expatriates, foreigners living in China, the trading group. And what did that trading group do? They wrote back to their church headquarters and said, we need a pastor here. Send us a pastor. We need somebody to baptize our children, to help us get married, to bury our dead. Send us a pastor to help us organize our church here in China. And so the government in the Middle East wrote to the government in China and said, our expatriates are requesting to have a religious worker sent to take care of their people. Could we do that? And they must have worked this out so that when the Christian missionaries arrived, and they probably arrived with other political people from the Middle East and delegation from that country, they were welcomed. And what happened, though, after his scriptures were translated in the Royal Library, the palace investigated their teaching. So they had a religious affairs bureau already in those days. And the Religious Affairs Bureau translated these sacred texts into Chinese. They examined them for a couple years. And then, after thoroughly understanding it to be suitable and true, special permission was given for its propagation. So here we have, written right on the stele, an announcement that the imperial government, the emperor itself, gave permission for the Christians to set up and start doing that. And just to give proof, he then quotes right on the text in part of the edict of the emperor. So the emperor's decree follows: the way has no single name, the holy takes no single form. When teachings vary from place to place, they give the greatest help to the largest number of people. Alopen was a man of great virtue from Da-Chin. He brought books and images from afar and presented them at the capital. He thoroughly explained their teachings, challenging, wonderful, serene in their operation. When its original teaching is discerned, it appears already mature. Its words have no complicated meaning, so when understood, it's not forgotten. Since it aids all creatures and profits mankind, it is proper that it be propagated everywhere. So we actually have this edict from secular Chinese sources as well to know that this really took place. So Christianity was given permission to set up shop, and then it continues to say that they were allowed to make 21 priests, ordain 21 priests and construct a temple, etc., and that the emperor's men continued to do that. So next week we're going to talk about the theological implications, and take a look, if you get a chance, here at the stele text, and I'll just give you a little bit of a background. Here it says, they call him the true Lord who is without beginning. True Lord, when I typed that in the other day to my AI translator on my computer, guess what popped up? Allah. So how, when you get, and this has been for 2,000 years, Christians have debated this, what's the best word in Chinese for the Christian God? And just like if you were trying to evangelize your Muslim neighbor, would you say, let me tell you about the real God, Allah isn't God, our God is the real God? Or would you say, Allah, you know Allah? We worship Allah too, but we will tell you who the real Allah is and what he really means. So do you use their terminology or do you come up with your own? This is always a missionary question we have that's very curious. But how do they distinguish here on the, here? Look at here, one Chinese lesson here. This is the number 3 in Chinese. Guess what number that is? 1. How do you describe God here? The 3-1. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, you better go back to confirmation class again with Pastor Schrader. It says, our 3-1 God. So they had their own ways, and you can come up here and see the 3-1 repeated several times on the stele. By the way, you read it from up here, start on this end and go down across the stele this way. And you can see how they started taking the Christian message and interpreting it for the people of China. So next week we're going to talk all about how that message comes along. So thank you for your attention. If you would like a copy of the book, it's $25 over here. We do accept Venmo as well. And look forward to having you come back. Any questions? I went a little long here. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again next week.